A narcissist doesn't fear losing the empath. They fear the empath waking up. And Carl Jung understood exactly why. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When an empath begins to make their unconscious conscious, when they start doing real shadow work, the narcissist's entire control system collapses. Stay with me, because what Jung discovered about the awakening process will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about these relationships. This isn't about revenge. This isn't even about the narcissist anymore. This is about the most powerful transformation a human being can undergo, and why it terrifies anyone who's been feeding off your unconscious patterns. What awakening looks like. Let's clarify what awakening actually is, because most people misunderstand it completely. They think awakening is dramatic. They imagine some explosive confrontation, a satisfying revenge plot, a moment where the empath finally wins. But Jung knew better. Awakening isn't revenge, it's awareness. And awareness is so much more powerful than revenge could ever be. Here's what it actually looks like. The empath starts recognizing patterns, not excuses. They stop explaining away behavior and start seeing it clearly. They stop asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and start asking, "Why did I allow this? Why did I stay? What was I getting from this dynamic that kept me hooked?" This is what Jung referred to as the beginning of consciousness. And it's subtle, it's quiet. It often happens in ordinary moments. Maybe the empath is replaying a conversation in their mind, and suddenly they notice the manipulation tactic they missed in real time. Maybe they're journaling, and a pattern jumps off the page, the same cycle, over and over, with different excuses but identical results. Maybe they're talking to a friend who gently points out, "This is the 5th time you've told me that story, and every time you sound like you're trying to convince yourself it wasn't that bad." Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But before you can become who you truly are, you have to see clearly who you've been." And for the empath waking up, this means seeing their own participation in the dance. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it's essential. The narcissist had power because the empath gave it to them, not because the empath was weak or stupid or deserved abuse, never that. But because somewhere in the empath's unconscious, there were wounds, beliefs, and patterns that made this dynamic feel familiar, maybe even feel like love. The awakening empath stopped seeing themselves as a victim and start seeing themselves as someone who made choices based on unconscious programming. And here's why this shift is so powerful. Victims are powerless, but people who recognize their unconscious patterns can change them. The narcissist built their control on the empath's unconsciousness. They exploited the empath's unexamined beliefs. "I have to earn love. I'm responsible for other people's emotions. If I just love them enough, they'll change. Leaving means I failed." These beliefs lived in the shadow, unquestioned and unchallenged. But once the empath starts bringing awareness to these patterns, once they start recognizing the manipulation tactics in real time instead of 3 days later, the game changes completely. The narcissist can feel it. They sense something shifting. The empath who used to chase them starts pulling back. The empath who used to cry and plead starts going quiet. The empath who used to take responsibility for the narcissist's emotions starts saying, "That's not mine to carry." This is awakening, and it's the beginning of the end of the narcissist's control. Shadow work begins. Now we get to the heart of Jung's teaching, the shadow work that changes everything. Because awakening is just the first step. Shadow work is where real transformation happens. Jung said, "The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors." In simpler terms, the shadow is everything we've pushed down, denied, or refused to acknowledge about ourselves. For the empath coming out of a relationship with a narcissist, shadow work means asking the hard questions, the questions that feel uncomfortable, even unfair, the questions that make you want to defend yourself. But Jung knew these were exactly the questions that led to freedom. The empath explores their own wounds. They ask, why did I overgive? Not why did they take so much, but why did I give so much even when I had nothing left? Jung would point to what he called the wounded healer archetype, the empath who learned early in life that their value comes from caretaking. Maybe they grew up with a parent they had to manage emotionally. Maybe they learned that love equals sacrifice, that being needed is the closest they'll get to being loved. This is shadow material. This is the unconscious belief system that made the narcissist's behavior feel almost normal, even if it hurt. The empath starts to see, I wasn't just attracting narcissists. I was attracted to them because they activated my deepest wound and gave me a familiar role to play. They ask, why did I ignore red flags? Jung talked about what he called psychic blindness, the way we literally can't see what our unconscious doesn't want us to see. The empath reviews the relationship and realizes the red flags were there from the beginning. The lies, the inconsistencies, the way they felt anxious and off balance but couldn't name why. But the empath's shadow contained a belief. I see the good in everyone. I give people chances. I'm not judgmental. These sound like virtues, and they can be. But in the shadow, they became defenses against seeing reality. The empath weaponized their own compassion to override their intuition. Shadow work means admitting, I saw the red flags. I felt the warnings, but I chose to override them because acknowledging them would have meant ending something I wasn't ready to end. They ask, why did I try to fix someone who didn't want to change? This is perhaps the deepest shadow work of all, because the empath has to confront what Jung called the savior complex, the unconscious need to rescue others as a way of avoiding their own pain. Here's the truth that lives in the shadow. Trying to fix the narcissist gave the empath a sense of purpose, a distraction from their own unhealed wounds, and a way to feel needed. If the narcissist had actually changed, the empath would have lost their role. The chaos became their identity. The suffering became their proof of love. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This is that moment. When the empath realizes they weren't just enduring the relationship, part of them needed it. And here's why this realization is so powerful, why it terrifies the narcissist more than anything. Self-awareness ends manipulation. Once the empath sees their own patterns clearly, once they've done the shadow work of understanding why they participated in the dynamic, the narcissist's tactics simply stop working. You can't manipulate someone who understands their own triggers. You can't gaslight someone who trusts their own perception. You can't control someone who's integrated their shadow. Jung understood that shadow work isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about reclaiming all the parts of yourself, including the parts that made poor choices, that ignored intuition, that gave too much. Not to shame yourself, but to understand yourself so completely that you can't be exploited anymore. Power shift. This is where everything changes. This is the moment the narcissist has been dreading since the relationship began. The narcissist senses the empath becoming emotionally independent. They panic. Control slips through their hands. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like. The empath who used to send long, emotional texts trying to explain how they feel suddenly goes quiet. The empath who used to react to provocations with tears or anger now responds with calm, detached observation. The empath who used to beg for crumbs of affection now seems fine. Not fine in that fake way where they're secretly falling apart. Actually fine. Genuinely at peace. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming a separate, whole individual. And for someone whose entire strategy has been to keep the empath enmeshed, dependent, and doubting themselves, this is catastrophic. The narcissist starts to feel something they've rarely felt before, powerlessness, and they don't know what to do with it. Here's what Jung understood about power dynamics in relationships. He said, where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking. The narcissist's relationship was always about power, dressed up as love. They maintained that power through the empath's unconscious need for their validation. But the empath doing shadow work stops needing the narcissist's validation. They start validating themselves. They stop seeking approval from the person who's been withholding it. They withdraw their energy, their attention, their emotional investment, not dramatically, but decisively. And the narcissist can feel the shift like a disturbance in the force. They'll often escalate at this point. Jung would explain this as a desperate attempt to reassert control through familiar patterns. They might hoover suddenly, showing up with apologies, promises, reminiscences of the good times. They might rage, trying to provoke the empath back into an emotional reaction, because any reaction is better than indifference. They might play victim, hoping to activate the empath's caretaking instinct one more time. But here's what's different now. The empath sees it all clearly. They recognize the hoovering for what it is, not genuine change, but manipulation. They observe the rage without internalizing it, not their circus, not their monkeys anymore. They feel compassion for the victim routine without taking responsibility for it, understanding that the narcissist's pain is real, but it's not the empath's job to fix. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to hold two opposites in consciousness simultaneously. The awakened empath can hold both compassion for the narcissist's wounds and firm boundaries against their behavior. They can acknowledge the relationship had genuine moments while accepting it was fundamentally unhealthy. They can release the person without releasing them with hatred. This is emotional maturity. This is integration. And this is what breaks the narcissist's control permanently. The power shift isn't about the empath dominating the narcissist. It's about the empath reclaiming sovereignty over their own life. Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." The empath has looked into their own heart, done the shadow work, and emerged as someone the narcissist can no longer reach. The empath's new boundaries. This brings us to the final stage, and the most misunderstood, the empath's new boundaries. Once an empath sets boundaries, they become untouchable. Not cold, just self-aware. Let me be clear about what this means, because people often confuse boundaries with walls. Jung distinguished between healthy individuation and defensive isolation. The awakened empath isn't closing their heart. They're protecting it with wisdom. These new boundaries aren't about revenge or punishment. They're not designed to hurt the narcissist. They're designed to protect the empath's hard-won peace. And that's what makes them so effective. Here's what Jung taught about boundaries. They're not about controlling other people's behavior. They're about clearly defining what you will and won't accept in your own life. The awakened empath stops trying to make the narcissist understand, change, or acknowledge the harm. They simply state, "This is what I will accept, this is what I won't, and I'll enforce these boundaries through my actions, not my arguments." The narcissist is used to negotiating boundaries. They're experts at finding loopholes, creating exceptions, and manufacturing emergencies that just this once require the boundary to be broken. But the empath who's done shadow work doesn't negotiate anymore. I don't engage in conversations where I'm being blamed for your emotions, not up for debate. I don't respond to manipulation tactics, not explained, just enforced. I won't continue relationships where my boundaries aren't respected. Not a threat, just a fact. Jung said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." The empath who's explored their own shadow, their own capacity for self-deception, their own patterns of enabling, their own reasons for staying, can now see the narcissist's darkness clearly without being seduced by it or trying to fix it. They become what Jung called psychologically differentiated, able to distinguish where they end and another person begins. They no longer absorb the narcissist's emotions, take responsibility for the narcissist's choices, or lose themselves trying to save someone from themselves. This is what makes them untouchable. Not that they can't be hurt, they're still human, still sensitive, still empathic. But they can't be manipulated anymore. They can't be controlled. They can't be convinced that up is down, that abuse was love, that they're responsible for someone else's refusal to grow. The narcissist will test these boundaries. Jung would predict these patterns don't die easily, and the narcissist's entire identity is built on the patterns that worked before. But the awakened empath stands firm, not with anger, not with vindictiveness, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows themselves completely. And often, the narcissist simply gives up. They move on to someone whose unconscious patterns they can still exploit. Because targeting someone who's done their shadow work is exhausting and unrewarding. There's no supply to be gained, no reaction to feed on, no unconscious wounds to manipulate. The transformation that changes everything. Carl Jung spent his life studying transformation, and he concluded that the journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, from fragmentation to wholeness, from shadow to integration, this is the highest calling of human existence. When an empath awakens and begins shadow work, they're not just leaving a toxic relationship, they're answering that calling. They're becoming what Jung called individuated, a complete, conscious, self-aware human being who can love without losing themselves, who can give without depleting themselves, who can set boundaries without cruelty. This is why the narcissist fears the awakening empath. Not because the empath will expose them or get revenge, but because the awakened empath represents everything the narcissist refuses to become: someone who's faced their darkness and integrated it, someone who's looked at their wounds and healed them, someone who's taken responsibility for their patterns and changed them. The awakened empath is living proof that transformation is possible, and that's the most terrifying thing a narcissist can witness: evidence that the work they're avoiding is the very work that leads to freedom. If you're an empath beginning this journey, understand, the shadow work is hard, awakening is uncomfortable. But Jung promised, and countless people have proven, that on the other side of that work is a version of yourself you never imagined possible, whole, free, untouchable in the best possible way. And that, according to Carl Jung, is worth every moment of the journey. Welcome to Empire of the Mind. Subscribe and share with your loved ones for more.